Now, Africa is timed to be the next frontier in the global market. The potential that Africa as a continent bears cannot be sidelined or downplayed. However, there are pertinent issues that are stopping Africa from leveraging its full potential and translating that into economic benefit. That's why I'm joined by Daniel Silk, who happens to be a director at Political Futures Consultancy, to have a discussion around social, political, and economic issues that act as a stumbling block towards the growth and development of Africa. Thank you very much, Daniel, for joining us. Just as we start this interview and set base for it, I would like us to talk about a general overview of the social, economic, and political state of the African continent and how it plays into the greater picture of economic development.
One is the positive side, which is there are more international travelers, more global travelers, and notwithstanding many of the geopolitical challenges that occur globally, notwithstanding issues relating to protectionism, to China-US trade wars, to Brexit, the travel industry itself, the travel and leisure industry and the business travel industry remains on solid ground. So that's positive. But the other side of the equation clearly is that these big global geopolitical risks do impact economies everywhere. They impact and will impact the developed world's economies over the course of the next year or two. They will impact China going forward as well, as Chinese growth is likely to slow moderately in the course of the next year or so. And we are seeing indications already in terms of Chinese manufacturing, the Purchasing Managers Index in China off the boil, so to speak. And we will see that and have seen that affect the emerging markets and also frontier markets like ours here on the African continent as well. However, I think these are relatively short-term duration events, and I think notwithstanding many of these big global threats, we continue to see very good growth coming out of many parts of the African continent. And indeed, I think with a global slowdown that may well occur over the next 12 to 18 months or so, investors may well see returns on investment here on the African continent in particular as being more favorable to them as the Western markets slow moderately. And I think we could return to even greater interest, as it happens, in the developing markets. It may be a very good time for many Western or developed businesses to come into Africa right now to position themselves for what will be a changing environment in the next year or so.
Now, it's interesting you're talking about economic slowdown in other parts of the world. However, Africa has been on this journey of economic recovery, and it's estimated that in 2019, when the global growth will be 2.9%, Africa will be at 4.2%. Now, this means good things for the African continent, and I would like us to talk about what this kind of growth rate means for the continent.
Look, I've always been optimistic about Africa, but I've always been realistic in terms of assessing where downturns will occur. And despite the fact that we will see above average global growth over the course of the next year for the African continent as a whole, we've seen how growth doesn't occur all the time. We've seen how that 2015-2016 period saw a decline in growth. It occurred here in Kenya as a result of political concerns. It occurred in the big markets of Nigeria and Angola as a result of declining commodity prices that are now back on track. It occurred in South Africa because of a generally weak economy, and it's still weak in South Africa. So growth rates don't just keep on going up. There are specific blips on the chart. But I do think that there is an important element of recovery. There's a higher degree of political stability in a number of jurisdictions. Certainly here in Kenya, we've seen a rapprochement between the two competing political forces, which is positive for confidence, and it brings investment in, and you've seen it directly in terms of the hotel and leisure industry. And you've seen it in terms of airlines and airline traffic as well arriving in Nairobi with increases coming through. So, I mean, there's a positive. In terms of Ethiopia, political change in Ethiopia in terms of a new president certainly looks as though it's going to open up that economy. I mean, there's important changes taking place there. There was a centrally planned economy where government controlled most of the critical state-owned enterprises. They look as though many of them are going to be part privatized, or there will certainly be a sell-off of some of these assets, which should unlock substantial value and also build confidence in the Ethiopian market. The same could be said for Angola. Historically a Marxist government in Angola, not known for its love of private enterprise, yet we are seeing important changes in that market, along with better oil prices coming through that could lift Angola once again. So again, political change and the climate that's being created, very important for many of these markets going forward. And again, it will be reflected in the amount of hotel developments, and already you are seeing it mirrored in a sense when you look at the pipeline of hotel developments coming forward. It will start to increase in these markets that have been a little subdued, even Nigeria. Once they get over their election next year, which always creates a degree of uncertainty, I think Nigeria hopefully will again start to resume a better GDP path and will look at growth rates in excess of 2.5–3%. And Nigeria desperately needs that with her very, very fast expanding population.
Now, Africa is growing not just in terms of the economy, but also in terms of population. It is estimated that by the year 2050, 37% of the global births will be in Africa. Now, numbers can translate into different things. It can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. And I would like us to talk about what it will mean to have over 1 billion people and a high rate of urbanization in the continent in the year 2050.
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. You can look at the glass half full, which suggests here is a continent brimming with young people able to do work, generally speaking, very well educated, certainly by comparison to their parents or grandparents. I mean, the literacy rates in Africa have soared in the course of the last 20–30 years. The workers of the world will be here. But of course, the glass half empty scenario suggests that where you have such rapidly expanding populations, unless you create fairly decent jobs for a very large proportion of people, you will sow the seeds of social instability if that does not occur. We all in the industry of talking heads and academics and analysts speak about this demographic dividend for Africa, the point at which Africans are no longer dependent and we can effectively feed ourselves. This demographic dividend on Africa will occur in the 2050–2060 period, but it is predicated upon good growth and job creation. And ultimately that's going to be the real defining factor. A big population without jobs ultimately is a danger. A big population with jobs is going to spur on this level of economic growth and this general enthusiasm for the African growth narrative that we see at the moment. So the pressure is on governments. The pressure is on good governance, the creation of transparent institutions, the same issues we've been talking about, which will improve competitiveness and ease of doing business across the continent. The pressure is on to really get that right over the course of the next 10 years. And I might add, the pressure is on the burgeoning urban infrastructure across many African countries to really get that right as well. Urban infrastructure will either aid all of this or will be an impediment to growth going forward. And I just think that physical environment in African cities is going to play a big role, and those cities that can harness the fourth industrial revolution, new modes of transport, those cities that can get that right are going to be the winners, and their populations will be the winners as well.
Such numbers create a market. However, Africa is not known for trading with itself. We've seen that being done in Europe, over 74% of trade, in Asia slightly over 50%. But in Africa it stands at a dismal 16%. Why is it important to have intratrade in the continent for us to realize economic development?
Yeah, I think all of us have been talking about this for a long time, and we've all well understood that we've got to bring it home. That's all there is to it. But bringing it home is easier said than done. The first step clearly is the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which will improve the logistical and tariff barriers that have existed between our various countries. And that, I think, sets the scene for an enabling environment. So the regulatory and the physical nature of cross-border transactions is beginning to be tackled. So I'll give it a tick, and I think there's progress there. The other key factor is that we as Africans need well to understand what each of our strengths are and how do we play to those strengths in terms of what we are good at manufacturing. What services can we export? There's always a simple equation in my mind. We need to make stuff that people need, that people want. And we have to understand who makes it at the best quality and at the best price as well. And I think that study probably still has to be undertaken across Africa to see where we can complement each other in terms of goods that are tradable goods across the borders. I think we are well on the way to the enabling environment, but the practical nature of this is going to be more of a medium-term issue to go forward. Yes, I think the interesting. I mean, there's a side issue to this. In a world that's becoming more protectionist and is moving away from big free trade areas, we on this continent are moving towards an association. We actually bucking the international trend, and good for us in a sense, because ultimately we need to help each other. The rest of the world are becoming more protectionist. They're looking after themselves. The Make America Great Again idea is looking after oneself. Well, Brexit and issues in Europe, populism in Europe as well, creating barriers between many parts of the European continent potentially and Africa and other emerging market countries, depending on how the political pendulum swings in Europe. So time for us to really react on that, and time for us to make our economies a lot more open and porous to one another, but equally so, the conditions for doing business have to be outstanding. We have to get rid of the usual issues, infrastructure constraints. You know, we need to prioritize that. Electricity across the African continent, which still affects nearly 500 million Africans who don't have access to proper electricity every single day. That's not good enough. We need to work on that particular issue. Again, transparent institutions really need to perform above patronage and corruption networks. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I think the imperatives are there to get it done, and this needs to be done to react to some of those negative global tendencies that we've spoken about.
There are several industries that have been doing really well in the continent, and hospitality is one of those industries. Now, I would like us to talk about the rate of tourist arrival in the country, the hotel pipeline supply, and also the consumer expenditure between the year 2019 and 2030.
Tourist arrivals, generally speaking, for Africa are up. In fact, they are certainly for 2017, we have the consolidated figures for 2017. They are largely well above the global average, and in fact, for the African continent as a whole, we are running about second in terms of global percentage arrival. So very healthy. Although we are still small in terms of global arrivals, the growth rate across the African continent has been impressive. And again, it's a function of better economic performance and an improved security conditions, partially for East Africa, but also for North Africa, where there's been a tremendous spurt of growth in the hotel industry, particularly in Egypt and in Morocco. And in terms of the hotel pipelines of rooms coming on stream, or keys coming on stream, as they say, once again, North Africa leads the way with Egypt and Morocco. Addis Ababa, again, with a huge increase in the amount of hotel rooms coming on stream. Here in Nairobi as well, big increases coming forward. There are challenges with that. You can have an oversupply of rooms, clearly. And that oversupply may last for a certain period until such a time as the economy again grows to absorb some of those new keys coming on the market. So I think the hotel operators themselves understand that the growth rates are going to largely come from developing markets into the future. There's a huge growth rate in hotel rooms in China. Africa remains underserved in terms of the availability of hotels across this continent, and with the increased arrivals and better than average economic growth rates, it makes sense that the Marriotts and Hiltons are fighting, in a sense, over properties across the continent. And that's why we see this amazing announcement of new rollout of properties just in the course of the last few days as a result of this conference.
Now, it has been a really interesting conversation with you, but before we wind up, I would like to ask, what does Africa need to do in order to position itself for economic takeoff, because it has the potential and there's the goodwill? What does it need to do?
It's a difficult question. There are a lot of strands to it. I think what's important for most of Africa is that economies need to diversify. many economies have been far too reliant upon one or two key industries, particularly those economies that have a commodity or what I call extractive base. Economies like Nigeria, Angola, even South Africa need to diversify out to services, which they are starting to do, and also into what I would call high-tech niche markets, which is a particular niche, alongside a more low-level manufacturing base that can absorb, in a sense, some of the jobs that will leave China as wages go up in China, seeking a more low-wage worker, of which Africa certainly does have and have in abundance. So I think Africa needs a mixed picture of all of these different aspects to enhance her productivity and to provide jobs for those millions of young people coming on stream. So there's no one silver bullet, in a sense, for the continent. But I do caution, though, and I think there's something that, when we don't talk, perhaps we do talk about it enough. We are entering an era of artificial intelligence. And I think for many industries across the world, not just for us here in Africa, there is a growing concern of how robotics are going to interact with human beings, particularly when it comes to lower-end manufacturing, which is a sector that Africa should be targeting. So understanding how machines work, how machines can augment the human being into the future is going to be vital for educational systems, not just in America, not just in China, but for us here on the continent as well. Still, there's a movement across the continent away from really low-level agriculture-based jobs to more service industry jobs. We see it in Kenya, we see it in Ethiopia, and I think that's the way to go. An interesting mix of all of these different facets, which can begin to absorb the millions of young people who will desperately need relatively decent work going forward. But that's another discussion for a number of hours.
Thank you
very much. Thank you.